webinar series. And so we started this kickoff back in May, and this is the second webinar we're having. And if you haven't gotten the email with the link to the first one or the PowerPoint PDF, please let me know. You can email me or message me here and I can get your info in the chat box, and I'll send that to you as well. And we will be recording today's session as well. And I will get you the links probably sometime next week once they're up and ready, along with the PowerPoint clip as well. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started today. As you probably can tell, you don't have access to speak. If that is something you want, instead of typing a question in the chat box or the Q&A, you can just let me know I want to talk, and I can change your access to the webinar, and we can see if we can work that way. The easiest thing would probably be to use the chat or the Q&A boxes, and you can type questions at any time. I'll be monitoring these as Annie talks today. And I will let her take over. Thanks for everyone for attending, and like I said, I will get this information out to you as soon as it's ready, probably sometime early next week. And Annie will actually be filling in for Dorothy for the final two sessions, but we'll let her introduce herself. So go ahead, Annie.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for participating in this webinar. My name is Annie Short, and I have been in the nonprofit world for over 10 years. My focus in nonprofit has been on drug prevention work, and I have done some mental health prevention work as well. And so I'm excited to share with you the grant writing webinar today. I've written many grants, some successful, some not. And so we will really just talk about the process and hopefully guide you in that effort, and hopefully you can be successful as well, because we do live and breathe by grants often. So hopefully you will get a lot out of today. As you can see, we have a poll because I'm curious just to see how many of you have written a grant before, and if you have written a grant, was the grant awarded? And that will just give me an understanding of your expertise within this process. Okay, so it does look like some of you have written grants, some of you have not, and it looks like most of you, if you've written a grant, have been awarded, so congratulations on that. It's always very exciting. Many of our grants that we write takes for a few months before you know if you've been awarded, and that's always stressful. So, so I know it's exciting when you actually get awarded the grant. So thank you very much for giving me that feedback. All right, so we will go into the webinar now. So with the grant writing, often when we talk about grant writing, it's literally because we are interested in having the money, right? Like that's why most of us say we need to write a grant. And those who don't write grants think it's really easy, and it's just like, oh, we need money to do this work, go find a grant and write it. And what it really should entail is that we should just be able to say, hey, give us some money because we need it, and hopefully everyone will jump in and say, oh, of course, we would love to give you money because we know that this will be a great grant and you're a great organization, and so here it is. And that would be great if that is how it works, but we all know that that is really not how it works. To write a successful grant truly takes time. It takes time to research and find those appropriate grants. It takes time to collect the data, the necessary information to even write the grant, and then you actually have to write the grant. And it does take some skills. You have to be able to write clearly, and it also means writing a story. You're trying to invite your reviewer into your community. So it takes a little finessing to be able to do that. And then also, oftentimes we think about writing the grant, but we never think about what happens when we get the grant. So we need to make sure that we have the resources to implement and manage the grant when and if we receive it. So to do that, I wanted to take an opportunity to look at a true grant that was out there One of the main grants that we use is the SAMHSA site, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And so I actually pulled that grant because what's important before we even write a grant is to determine if a grant is a good fit for our organization. So here's an example of a grant that we could have written for that we pulled. And this one is for, it says to grants for the benefit of homeless individuals. So when you pull up this grant on their website, there's a few key things that any organization should look at first before determining if this is a good fit for them. So the first thing is the application due date. So if I was to say, hey, I found that there was this grant and I noticed that, oh, the deadline was April 25th, well, this grant obviously would not be a good fit because it's now June. The other thing to look at too is even though it may be in before this current time, so say if it was a July due date, you still have to consider, do you have enough time to write the grant? Often when these grants are given, there's a short turnaround before the application is actually due. And so it's important to make sure that you have the time to put into this to write the grant to make the deadline. Because there's nothing worse than going through all the work of writing the grant and then missing the deadline. So that's the first consideration. The next is the description. So this gives you a clear understanding of an overview of what the grant is about. What are the purposes of this grant and how does it really apply to hopefully what you're looking to do? So there would be the description. Next on this, usually the front page, is the eligibility. So this is important. Often most grants are either for local governments, state governments, nonprofit organizations, education, those pieces, but sometimes the eligibility is specifically for, say, only a state entity or a tribal entity, or even a grant that I'm currently working on is for a rural community only. So you want to make sure that you fit within that eligibility. And then next is this award information. And we'll go through these, and I pulled them up because in part of the grant application is what's also the executive summary. So everything that you see in this award information is also in this executive summary. So as you can see, here's the description again, and then it goes through all this funding information and important information to understand about the grant. So again, here is the due date for applications, which we talked about, making sure that that's a good fit. But then the other thing to look at is, for instance, the estimated number of awards. So this grant, there's only up to 24. So this is a national grant. So the competition is very fierce because 24 is not a lot when you're talking about a whole United States. Some grants I've seen even have only like 3 awards or 12 awards. And the one that I'm currently working on only has 24. And so we are debating if we feel like it's a good use of our time because 24 out of a nation is very tight competition. Next is the estimated award amount. So 400,000 is not any small chunk of change. So definitely worth some effort because there's good money behind this. Interesting, it also has a cost sharing match required, which says no, which we'll talk a little bit more later in this presentation. But this is important too because some grants do require a match, which means, say for instance, if it says 100%, that would mean, yes, we are getting $400,000 per year, but we also have to have a match, and sometimes it's in other dollars, sometimes it can be in kind, but that's important to know if you can match that amount. This one has no match, which is really great. So another bonus to this grant. And the length of project period is 5 years, which is a good grant because sometimes the grant is only for a year and typically it's usually 3 years. So a 5-year grant really allows you time to have a good chunk of money to do work and have some time to put into it because as we know, it takes a lot of time to build up the resources and then to implement all of the programs that we need to do. So if it's only a 1-year grant with a lot of expectations, again, it may not be a good fit. So those are all the things that you want to consider, and the executive summary is one of those sheets that's a really good sheet to pull out and work with others to say, is this a good fit for our community? Other things within the application to consider, and as you go through the application, these are some of the bulleted headlines that will be in that application. So sometimes they have required activities. This grant did not, but sometimes they do, where it may be specific things that you have to do. And again, you want to make sure, can your community actually do what they're asking you to do? The allowable activities will tell you what are those activities that they will allow you to use the grant dollars for. And again, this is important because sometimes what you envision for your community to actually do is not what the grant wants you to do. And so it's important to understand that and see if they align. Because if the grant is asking you to do a whole bunch of other things that is not part of your plan, it may take you out of the scope and actually create more work for you than what you have the money and the resources to do. They also will also have other expectations. So this one is pretty basic. It just asks for a impact statement, which is pretty manageable, but sometimes they will have that you have to do various evaluation pieces, or that you actually have to create a whole evaluation team. And so those are things to consider because, again, if they're asking you to do things that are way beyond your scope, it may not be a good fit. And or even think about the dollars that they're asking you to do these things with. Does it fit? One grant that I had applied for, I was very excited about, and because I thought, hey, it was one of my first grants. I think it was like $50,000, which was not a small amount of money for us as a small organization. And so I was excited, and I didn't know all these details to really look at. And so once we got the grant, I spent most of my time trying to develop evaluation pieces, putting a team together, and meeting their obligations of evaluation. That most of that money was spent on that, which did not leave us a lot of money to do the actual work. So you want to keep those into consideration. The other thing that they often will put in there is funding limitations or restrictions. So often when you write a federal grant, they will not allow dollars to go towards food or sometimes equipment or specific programs. And so you want to see what they're restricting you, because it may be the very dollars that you need to do your projects. And so if those dollars are not applicable, then it's probably not a good grant. If it's not restricting you on the things that you want to do, again, it may be a grant that you'll want to consider. And then again, the project outcomes and evaluation requirements versus the funds awarded. So always make sure that you understand what they're asking of you before you apply. Also, within most grants, if you have a first year grant, often they'll ask you to send 2 people or 3 people to a meeting. And I just wanted to put this in there because it does make a difference in your budget. This one does not ask for a whole lot. It's one meeting. However, some grants I've written for, they expect people to travel 3 times a year for continuous meetings. So it's just something to be aware of because it does have an impact on your budget as well as how many people are going and the expectations of the grant. So another thing just to look at to see if that's what they're asking for you to do in these grants. So that's kind of the first step of, okay, we've gone through all these pieces. We've looked at the application deadline. We've looked at the eligibility. Do we fit to that? Do we feel like we can compete with how many grants are being awarded? And all of those pieces, especially what are some of the restrictions, what are the expectations, and if after all of that we realize, wow, this is a good fit for us and this is a grant that we want to proceed with, then comes the real work, and that's the writing of the grant. So I just want to take a moment and see if anybody had any questions on just that first part, because it's pretty intense and it really is important for you to go through those pieces and make sure it's a good fit, because as we'll see, it takes time to write these grants. So you don't want to get halfway through and go, oh, it's not worth this, based off of what they're expecting us to do. It's good to look at all of those pieces up front. All right, hearing that we have no questions, we will continue on to the writing of the grant, the fun part of this. So in most of your grants, they'll have an evaluation criteria that's listed. And this is an important section to always refer back to. So for instance, they will give you usually the project narrative of how it needs to be written. So in this grant application, the grant can be no longer than 30 pages. The pages must be with a 1-inch margin, single spaced, and time Romans 12 point. And most people are like, what's the big deal? But this is very critical. If you are even over 1 page, often, especially federal grants, your grant will be kicked out and not even reviewed. I've had some people lose a grant because their margins were only a 1/2 inch and not a full inch. So it is very critical to pay attention to this. And sometimes it's frustrating because a lot of times some grants will only give you like 15 pages, and it's hard to tell a story in 15 pages. But it is critical to follow this piece.
Annie?
Yeah.
A question just came in. Somebody wanted to know, what does FAO mean?
FAO is, I was just going to look this up, sorry. I'll tell you in a moment. No, I won't. I'm sorry, I should know this because we use the language all the time, and for some reason my brain this morning did not work around that. So I will look it up for you and tell you, okay?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, sorry. And I should know it, and we speak it all the time. So I'm having a blonde moment today. So hang in there with me. So again, just make sure to follow those pieces because it is critical. I've had grants dismissed because of these small pieces. This grant requires that you use their 5 section headings in your project narrative. So the project narrative is basically the whole grant that you're writing. So in this grant, and we'll kind of review this too, that you will want to have those headings. This one also just reminds you that you cannot combine 2 or more questions or refer to another section of the project narrative. And also making sure that you are answering those specific questions. So you do not want to refer and say, oh, in section 2, and you're in section 3, because the reviewers will not go back. You want to answer specifically the questions that they're asking. And then you also want to start looking at the number of points that are given to each of those sections, because this will be critical for you to understand how much effort and how much space to give to each section. So here is an example of their sections. They have section A, B, C, D, and E. So if you can see section A, the population of focus and statement of need is only 15 points versus the section B, which is proposed implementation approach of 30 points. So not that you'd put little effort into section A, but you also want to make sure you have a lot of information in section B. And when you're looking at those pages of how many pages are provided to you, so this, again, this grant was giving us 30 pages, you don't want to spend 25 of those pages on section A. You want to make sure that you're giving enough space to section B because that has your most points. And these points are critical, not that you want to spend all of your effort on those 30 points and not focus on some of the other sections, but just understanding how important this is. I've had grants that have been missed because of 1 point. So every point matters. And quite honestly, I think missing a grant by 1 point is harder than when you miss a grant by 30 points because you're like, oh, 1 point, I was so close. So you want to pay attention to these and make sure that you're giving due diligence to each of them, but making sure that you're putting a lot of effort and making sure that you're really hitting each of those points in that section B because of how many points are given. So here's a sample of their section A of here's what they're asking for people to write about. So they have the section A, which is the population of focus and statement of need. And then they have each of the questions, section 1, 2, and 3. And you will want to read through each of these questions and make sure that you're answering each one of these points. So for instance, in section 2, it says discuss the differences in access, service use, and outcomes. When you are writing for your application, you will want to make sure that you are addressing each of those pieces. You want to make sure that you're including information about the access, service use, and outcomes. And even when I write grants and I do my first draft, and then when I go back, I actually make sure that I have checked each of these. So I will use a red pen and check, yes, in this section, I did answer about access. I did answer about service use, and I did answer about outcomes, because each of those are critical in order to make sure that you've achieved those 15 points. Because often when a reviewer is given a page to review, they're asked, did they meet each of the questions and each of the bullets? And the points are really more based off of, did you answer those? And then it's on, was the information important? So you want to make sure that you're answering each of those. So when we submit our grants, even though this application said you only have to put the section A or those headers, we actually still even abbreviate. So like question 1, identify your populations of focus. That way, as a reviewer, they know that we've answered each of those questions and they don't have to search for it. It is very clearly defined that yes, we were responding to the questions that they asked. And so we will list not only the headers, but we will list each of the questions. And I think this is important because I have even done reviewing of grants, and people who have not put these questions, they do mix them all together in the paragraphs. And it makes it very hard as a reviewer, because think about it, often reviewers are reviewing anywhere from 3 to 10 applications at a time. It starts to kind of mesh all together. So the clearer that you can make your application, the better it is for the reviewer to know that yes, you answered each of those questions, and then can reward you the points accordingly. Other things to remember is when I usually do my first grant, it is very overwhelming to look at all of those questions and to think how am I going to fit it within to 2 or 3 pages in this maximum of 30 pages. So really what we often do is we will go through and answer the questions with all of the details that we can think of. So putting in any of the data that we can think through, putting in any of the statistics, any of the points of our community, and we just put it all in there. And then we can always go back and start to edit to make sure that we're fitting within those page grant requirements. But the more that you can put out there, it's much easier to then identify which pieces are important and which pieces were nice to know but are not critical for the success of the grant application. Again, make sure to answer each point and do not refer the reviewers to another section or to another page. Make sure that it's within that question so they don't have to search for it, because they will not. And most of them are told that they cannot go to different sections. They have to answer the question based off of what's there for that question. The other thing we hear often is, I feel like I'm writing the same thing over and over. Yep, you will be. A lot of times the questions in themselves are a way to see if you are answering consistently, or did you just make something up in one section and then make up something else in another section. So often they will compare in a sense of, oh, they put it in this section as X, Y, and Z, but in the other section it's more of an ABC. And then it puts doubt into the reviewer's mind. So you want to make sure that you're consistent in your stories and your message, and recognize that there will be times that you feel like you're writing the same thing over and over. But that's how the grants are. And if you're truly writing the grant based off of each of the questions, it's imminent that you will feel like you're having duplication. And then remember the section points that are allowed to ensure that you're scoring your sections as highly and effectively as possible. So making sure that you're giving due diligence to each of those questions, but that there's a lot of extra information in those points that are higher scored. And always make sure to write clear and concise with complete information for each section and each bullet. When you think about trying to get to the impact of this application, because you're one of many, you want to make sure that you're providing information on your proposal and how it will affect the targeted population. Be as detailed as possible so that the reviewer understands that their dollars truly will have an impact on your community, that you've thought through this application and that you're not just on a whim applying for a grant, but that you have really thought through how the dollars will be used and how they will impact your community. You want to think like a reviewer. Again, reviewers, they are reviewing many grants. One time when I reviewed, I had 25 grants to review, and I will tell you, it was very hard by the 15th person to feel like I actually knew the difference between that one and others. And so you want to make sure that your proposal is standing out. Often you can't put pictures in, but you can give a picture through your story. And so that's why it's important to have someone who can not only write clearly and concisely, but how they can tell a story, how to draw the reviewer into your community and problems. So for instance, when we write our grants and in my organization, when we talk about our population, we often talk about that we have more cows than we do individuals. So they understand that, yes, we are a very rural community and that we are a strong farming community and that we have issues here too, but that they see beyond the scope of just the problem. So we talk about the cows, we also talk about that we have a lake next to us, we talk about our tourism, so they understand the full scope of that. And that's really how then it creates that impact of like, oh, this community really has something different from others. So you want to think about how you can draw that reader into your problems. Provide statistics when possible. If you are constantly saying, oh, we have many issues, or we've had many details that we've been working on for years, that doesn't tell the reader that you really know what's going on. So the more that you can say, for instance, yes, we have many problems, including that we have the highest number of people who are drinking than any other county surrounding us by 20%. That creates not only a picture, but it gives detail. So that way they can truly see that we're not just making this up because, there is the perception that even for our youth, that they're always bored and that there's nothing to do in the community is a typical thing. That's a perception. But when we can clearly say we have this number of activities, then we can start to create that picture and be more specific into what's going on in our community. And when you're including a large amount of data, because often it will ask for data, think about how you can present that in a way that is easy to understand and a quick format. So often a table format, if it's allowed, is really helpful because otherwise think about this again as a reviewer. If you're reviewing a 30-page document and you have, say, 5 of those to read, it can be very daunting. And if all of your data is in a paragraph format, it really starts to become daunting for that reviewer to even keep that all straight. So think about how to make all of your pieces easy for them to read and easy for them to remember and even easy to refer back to if they need to. And don't overemphasize. Again, you want to talk about your problems and you also want to be realistic, but you don't want to, again, put in false information because if they ever do come back to your community, you want to show that you were legit in what you were putting into your application. So speak the truth and stick to the facts. Next is the budget. So often most of these grants do not score you on your budget, which is great, but they still require it. And the budget is still important because it does refer to what your application has in it. So you don't want to just put a budget and make up some numbers. It needs to be thought through, and you need to be able to justify why you're asking for the dollars. And most grants will ask you that you not only put a budget together, but that you also give it justification. So when you think about your budget, you want to think again about that match. We talked about that. So if they're asking you that you have to do a match, so say this grant was $400,000, and say if this grant did ask for them to have a match, you would need to think about what that match would look like. If it's truly hard dollars that they're asking for, $400,000 is a lot of money to come up with a match. If you had $400,000, quite honestly, then you're probably doing really well that the grant may not help as much. So you want to think about how you're going to come up with those dollars. Most grants will do an in-kind match. So that could be having your volunteers at a coalition meeting, you can count for those hours. Or if your organization is giving you free space, that's a match. And so you will have to put that together. Include in your narrative the justification of those numbers. So if you're asking for $30,000 for a campaign, You will need to think about how you came up with those numbers. Not that at the end of the budget you had $30,000 left and you didn't know what to do with it, so we're just going to put it into a media awareness campaign. It may be based off of the fact that you've done a media awareness campaign before and that was the budget. That would be a justification. Then you also want to make sure that you use the right numbers. You want to show that you just didn't put a bunch of numbers in there and hope that it would add up. So make sure that you're calculating for those dollars to make sure that they align and that they're matching with what is required. And that the budget has a plan behind it, that you're not just asking for dollars because it seems like the right thing to do. You want to make sure that it fits within your overall organization's budget and that it fits within the projects and the plans that you're asking for. And you want to make sure that you use only the line items on the federal forms. Most of these federal grants will give you all the different sections for the budget, and you will want to stick to those. Again, you want to include information about matching funds or cost sharing if it is required, and be sure to include any relevant budget information when it's appropriate. You don't need to overextend the information, but you need to make sure that you're including specifically why you're asking for those dollars. So here's an example. If they ask for the justification, like here, describe the role and responsibilities of each position, you want to think about, okay, if we're asking for a program director, make sure that you're putting that we're asking for, say, 40 hours and that the program director will be responsible for the oversight of the grant or whatever that is. And then again, here's some other examples of like if you're asking for local travel, break down those numbers. So we're asking for $550. That equals the 1,000 miles times the 55 cents per mile. And that is based off of local travel that is needed for staff to attend local meetings and statewide meetings. Or again, here's a media awareness campaign. So breaking down those numbers so it shows that you just didn't throw a number in there, but that you had thought through how those dollars would be used and what they are needed for. Once you have all that together, you're going to start pulling everything into your application. Again, go back to what is that criteria, making sure that you're fitting within, if it's only asking for 30 pages, that you only have 30 pages. And think about your margins. If it's single spaced or double spaced, what's the font of the size font? Then have people go back and make sure that you're answering all of those questions and that you've listed the headings, the subheadings, and that it's very clear to follow along with the application. Then make sure your budget dollars are requested are fitting within that applicable funds, making sure that it aligns with what your project is asking for. Not that you're putting something in the budget that you've never talked about in your grant, because then they'll know that something's not aligning. We'll talk about they have appendixes that often you will need to include. So these may be forms that they're asking you to fill out, and you'll want to make sure that you include those. Have others proofread for context and clarity. And these people that you want to proofread are people who have not helped you pull anything of the grant together, because it is important to have fresh eyes, because when you're putting a federal grant together, often you're spending a good chunk of your time on it. And so in your mind, you've answered it, because remember, we've talked about duplication. So often you're like, I've already answered that, and it's fine. So you want to make sure that you have people on standby who are willing to proofread your grant, who have never looked at anything that you've written previous to this, so that they can clearly go through and make sure that you've answered each of those questions and that it makes sense. Again, know and meet your deadline, including if you have to. Most of our grants now, you're doing those online. Sometimes you mail them. But I will even tell you, so I'm ashamed to admit this, but I actually missed a grant because I had to submit it online and our computer system was having problems. And so my application got 5 minutes late from the actual deadline. And so it was kicked out. So it's important to make sure you know when the deadline is and make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to get it in, despite any problems that might happen with electronics or even with the mail service. And then the other key thing is just remember, you can constantly find ways to fix the grant, and at some point you just have to set the deadline and be okay with that, because you can drive yourself crazy trying to make sure you've fixed everything. And there's always opportunities for wordsmithing. So you just have to make sure you pick a deadline and stick with it, and just feel confident in what you're submitting. Because again, if it's late, it will not be accepted at all. So there are some groups who will utilize grant writers, and so I just wanted to talk about some of the benefits and disadvantages of a grant writer. If you have a grant writer in-house, that's great, or if you want to try it yourself, that's fine too. But there are sometimes benefits of having a grant writer, and often it's because of the expertise that they're bringing to the table. If they've written successful grants before, they have shown that they have some skill in being able to write and tell that story and to submit things based off of what the application is asking for. Also, if you have a small staff, just remember writing grants can take a lot of time. And so it might be easier to have someone as a grant writer to be able to take the time to write the grant. However, just know if you hire a grant writer, you still have to do some work. It's not like you hand everything over and the grant writer just does it. And often, because the grant writers have been successful, it may increase your chances of actually having the grant awarded. Not always do you hire a grant writer and the grant is awarded to you. So it's a 50-50 chance that you're taking with utilizing a grant writer. Some of the disadvantages is obviously you usually have to pay for a writer unless you find someone who's generous with their time or trying to do this in a new process for themselves. They may write it for free or at a discounted cost. They do not always have an expertise within what your application is about. So like for this grant that I've been using, it's about homelessness. And if the grant writer's never really written anything in that field, there may be some learning curves for that person to understand the language that goes with that field. Also, again, the staff or volunteers, you still have to put the work into it to make sure that the grant writer has the information that they need, that they understand your community, they have the data, you can refer to them about what you need, why you need it. Those are all things that the grant writer will not know until they spend time with you. And you often will have to grab all the data and start to put together some of the context for the grant writer to use. Again, there's no guarantees that the grant will be funded, and sometimes the grant writer is not allowed as a reimbursable expense within the grant. So you would have to find outside dollars to pay for the grant writer. In terms of finding a grant writer, you want to make sure that you ask for previous experience, or unless it's someone new who's honest about, hey, I'm trying this out for the first time and would love to write a grant for you for free. You also want to make sure that they have time to commit to the grant and meeting the deadline. So usually that will be one of the first things they ask is, when is the application due? But make sure they understand when it is due, and understanding what is your time commitment that you can give to them to make sure that the grant is written. It also may be beneficial to find someone before grant opportunities, because often when these grants come up, you only have maybe a month, sometimes 3 months, to actually write the grant and submit it. So to try to find someone may take a little time to do. And so again, you may want to start looking for a grant writer up front, and even starting to give them some information about, most grants always include some of the demographics and your history of your community and those things that the grant writer could start putting together. A typical fee is about $5,000, or sometimes a percentage of the award grant funded. So if the grant was $400,000, they may say, okay, I need 10%. I've also had some grant writers, I know that they'll charge a base fee, often again based off of the percentage, but it's only half of that. And if the grant is awarded, then you will pay the full amount. If it's not awarded, you only pay the base fee. Some places to look, maybe your local foundations, your United Way, extension offices, schools, government, or other nonprofit agencies. maybe you, as multiple nonprofit agencies, you could work together to have one grant writer and share that person's expertise. Finding grants, this again can take some time. Unless you're on a lot of listservs, you have to go out and search for them. So look for various foundations. There is, if you do a Google search, you can Google search foundations directory online. And within that foundations directory online, you can enter information about like your geographic, what is your subject, and it will show you which foundations would be a good match for you to write for grants. Look at your city government. Sometimes they get special grants that they're willing to give to the local organizations. State government often gets grant dollars and they're looking for organizations to partner with. The federal government, you can see there's two different ones that I put for links. There's the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance and grants.gov. There's also Grant Space. And those often you can put in your information and they'll send you information when a grant that fits your demographics, that then they'll send you, hey, there's a new grant opportunity. So those are good if you can log in and get registered. And then you can always do a Google search of just, for instance, like maybe grants after school program for Iowa City and see what pulls up. And that you would have to do on a regular basis to see what's out there. And again, some sites will allow you to be notified of the grants based on identified specifications. Also think about, depending on your organization, do you fit? So most grants require you to be a government agency, a school, or a 501c3 nonprofit agency. So if you are not a 501c3 nonprofit agency, there is such a thing as seeking a fiscal agent. A fiscal agency is an organization, sometimes the United Way will play this role. For instance, my grant is not really fits with the mission, or it's not the objective of my organization. My organization does a lot of healthcare work. Obviously, the mission to provide services and support in the community is in alignment, and so they are our fiscal agent for most of our grants. And so they provide the fiscal oversight. We actually have someone who provides our audits for us. They do our bookworking for us, pay our salaries, that kind of stuff. And so they're our fiscal agency. And so if you're not a 501c3 and you're interested in writing grants, again, you will want to form that relationship with a fiscal agency before you start looking for grants, because it will take some time to find that fiscal agent and make sure that the pieces are in alignment. And often they would have to approve whether they're willing to be the fiscal agent for a certain grant. Because for some nonprofit agencies, if you hit a max of how much money they're receiving, it will depend on how much of an audit that they have to do. So again, for instance, my fiscal agent, the 2 grants we just brought in put us over the threshold, so we will have to have a more intense audit. And my fiscal agent was fine with that, but he also made sure that we included in our budget for these grants those additional dollars needed for this additional audit. So things to think through. Once you have all that done, seems like an easy step, I'm sure, is the whole submission. So again, you want to include that time for one last review of the criteria. Did you hit all the points that they're asking you to do? And recognizing once you submit your application, it's final. There's nothing you can do, and you just have to trust the process. So you can't make edits after it. So make sure you feel very confident in what you're submitting. As I mentioned, don't wait until the last minute, because you do not want to lose out on a grant because you are 5 minutes late. You want to mark your calendar. Grant reviews take time. So the one grant we just wrote for, it will take 5 months before we're notified if we're awarded the grant. That's a long time. So we mark our calendars so we know when we're supposed to hear back from them. And then again, you want to look at when is that date of award supposed to be given, so you can mark that on your calendars. And hopefully you will receive your grant. And so you want to make sure that you're celebrating the success that you actually submitted it, but also then make sure that you are celebrating when you receive it. if you don't receive your grant, often they will give you information or feedback of why you were not awarded, and it's important to look at that feedback so you can learn from it for your next submission. Overall, you want to determine what you need to fund. Sometimes there are organizations who will just go after the dollars, and then they find themselves very scattered in what they're doing, so you want to make sure it's a good fit. I would encourage you to start searching for grants. Even if you're not in the place where you can write, it's helpful to start looking at what grants are asking for based off of your subject area so you can start putting those pieces together. Even having some baselines of information. So when you are ready to write for a grant, because it's usually a short turnaround time for submission, that way you can start to put together some of those pieces already needed for the grant in the future. It again takes time to write the grants, so you may want to even look for if you need a grant writer or that fiscal agent. And then remember, grants are provided for limited times. So you still want to continue to work on other funding sources for sustainability. Grants are great, but they're short term, or even 5 years is not that long. So you always need to think about how you're funding and sustaining future work beyond the grants. Any questions?
Annie, this is Amanda, and nothing has come through, but if anyone does, feel free to type in the chat or in the Q&A. Or if anyone has any tips or anything else they want to share. Did we find out what the FAO stood for?
Yes, sorry, it's the Funding Opportunity Announcement.
Thank you. All right, well, it doesn't look like anyone has, oh, everyone just said this is great information. Thank you. Oh, here comes one question. Will you please address online application submittals?
So you will have to look at how the application is done. So a lot of these federal grants, you will have to actually set up an account in grants.gov, and it's a process, and they will tell you that in the grant. So if you go to grants.gov, you can, if actually, Amanda, if I pull it up on my screen through the internet, will they be able to see it?
Yes, as long as you share that screen. So you'll stop sharing your PowerPoint and then you can share your internet, definitely.
Okay, let me see if I can pull this up for you guys really quick. And again, this is if you are going to start writing for federal grants, you will want to do this because it takes a few weeks. Like you have to enter stuff based off of, and again, it's based off of either if you need a fiscal agent or if you are a 501c, you will enter that information for that. It's been a while since I've actually had to do this. So let me see if I can figure it out while we're talking. But usually you will have to submit your information, and then it takes a few days that they'll send you, they'll actually send you more information that you have to basically verify that yes, you're legit, and then it goes through another process, and then you'll get an ID. And then once you get that ID you have to show that you're legit, and then that's how you actually apply for the grants, is through this whole grants.gov. And again, it's been like 7 years since I've had to do this, so let me see. But again, this is one of those great sites that you can put in your information, and they can send you notices when there's a grant that fits within your subject area. Other grants, so like the grant that I missed by 5 minutes, which, oh my gosh, tore me up forever. That was a basic one that was one of our state agencies who had a grant application. And it was literally, you just had to submit the grant to their email address. But it had to be stamped by like 5 p.m. and it got there at like 5:05 or whatever. The only good news is that state agency didn't get their funding either, so nobody got funded, so it made me feel better. But again, very frustrating because you spend all this time writing it. And then others will just be very specific to tell you, like, you either have to submit it through this web portal or it will tell you exactly how you need to do that. Amanda, I don't see it on here, so it's going to take me a little bit, but what I'll do is in the PowerPoint slides before I send them to you, I will add a page to that of grants.gov to show exactly where to go, so that way if people want to get registered, oh, it's probably up here, where it says register, sorry. So you'll go there and then you'll have to register either way. And again, most of the grants are organizations, so you'll want to look at this and you fill out this whole form. So that's the process for the grants.gov, but others are very specific of which portals you have to use. And what you'll get is this DUNS or the DUNS +4 number. And that DUNS number is what, like for a federal grant, you have to have a DUNS number to actually enter the grant because they have their own portal that you send it through then. So there's that one. Any other questions?
Thanks, Annie. I don't see anything else coming through. We can just stay on for a couple more seconds and see. And if you want to add that to the slides, feel free to do that as well.
Yep, I will, just so that way it's in there.
Perfect. All right, well, it doesn't look like anything else is coming up, so thank you so much. What great information today. I just got done writing some AmeriCorps grants, so it was kind of like making me relive it, but it was good. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Welcome. Yeah. And good luck.
Yes, thanks.
All right, thanks.
Yep. And to everyone else, I will be sending out the link once it's ready, and I'm hoping by the middle of next week. So thank you so much for attending, and we will see you at the next session on July 13th.